Hi, this is Jill Bittner, and the purpose of this short video is to begin the process of learning how to approach a pedigree problem in genetics. And for this video, I'll be showing you how to determine whether or not a pedigree is showing dominant transmission of an unusual allele for an unusual trait or recessive transmission. So I have for you two pedigrees here. These are pretty standard looking pedigrees. So you might be given something like this. We'll start with letter A. And when you first get a pedigree, you need to know that the shaded individuals, the squares and the circles, squares are males, circles are females, the shaded individuals are showing some kind of unusual trait, some kind of unusual phenotype. And the unshaded individuals are not showing it, so we call them normal. And in the beginning, when we look at pedigrees, we're only considering those two possible types of alleles, a normal allele or an unusual allele for this gene. And so the question is the unusual allele being transmitted as a dominant allele, or is it being transmitted as a recessive allele? And we can figure this out with a fair degree of certainty by looking at these pedigrees. Now, remember that this is always a hypothesis when you're proposing a hypothesis for whether or not the allele is being transmitted in a dominant or recessive way. But when we look at this pedigree at the top, letter A, we see that you have in the third generation there are 3 individuals that show the unusual trait. In the second generation there are 2 individuals, and in the first generation there's 1. And so what I usually tell students to do is look, start at the bottom, start at the newest generation, the youngest generation, and sort of work your way up. And what you're going to do is you're only going to look at the shaded individuals, those who are showing the trait, the unusual trait, and you're going to ask yourself this question: does every individual who has the unusual trait also have at least one parent that has the unusual trait? And you need to check everybody in the pedigree who is affected, 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 not infected, affected by the trait. If you look at the individuals who are affected and you see if they have at least one parent that's also affected. So in the third generation, you can see that each of the shaded individuals, the affected individuals, do have a parent that's also affected. And you can see them in the second generation. Then you move up to the second generation and you ask, do these individuals have a parent that's affected? And yes, they do. Now, we don't have any more information. We don't know about the parents of this first generation male, but the evidence that we have here does indicate a dominant transmission because it fits the definition. The test for dominance, again, is does every individual who has the unusual trait also have a parent that has the unusual trait? So if it fits, then you're going to assign the trait, the unusual trait, to the dominant allele, and you can make up any letters that you want. Here I'm using the letter R. Big R, dominant, is going to represent the unusual trait allele, and then little r, the other possibility for gene R, the little r allele, the recessive allele, is going to represent the normal. And so then you can go in with each individual and assign a genotype. So if little r is normal, then the genotype of individuals who are completely normal would have to be little r, little r. So you can assign little r as the genotype for all the unshaded individuals in the pedigree. For the shaded individuals, we know they have to have at least one big R that's being passed down through the family. But then the question is, for example, in this first generation individual, are they big R or big R little r? In order to answer that question, you have to you can either look at that individual's parents, and in this first generation case we don't have that information, or you can look at their children. Now when you look at this first generation male, he has a child that's not affected. This child is little r. And we know that inheritance comes, each allele comes from each parent. So this parent that's unaffected would pass a little r allele to the child. This parent would pass a little r allele to the child. So that means this affected male in the first generation has to be big R, little r genotype. And you would continue working through all of the unusual or shaded individuals and look at their children and look at their parents and determine whether or not they're big R or big R little r. So you could work your way through that pretty easily at that point, just using logic. Now, in the second case that I gave you here, this is the sort of the other way the pedigree could look. You have a pedigree where you have an individual, two individuals in the third generation that are affected, and only one individual in the first generation that's affected. But again, what I would just suggest is just try your test for dominance. The test for dominance is, does every affected individual also have a parent that's affected? And right away you see a violation of that rule. So the very first individual you try does not have a parent that's affected. This individual does not have a parent that's affected. So if you find any violation of the rule anywhere in the pedigree, that means you're going to assign the pedigree as recessive. It's not dominant, therefore it's recessive. And what you're saying when you say it's recessive is that the unusual allele is being carried as a recessive. So we'll put little r as the unusual trait, and big R is normal. And I think you can see how that assignment of the alleles is opposite of what we had in example A. So in example B, if little r is the unusual trait, then the individuals who have the unusual trait must be homozygous recessive, little r, little r. So this individual here in generation 3, this individual in generation 3, and then the individual in generation 1 are all little r, little r. And everybody else is big R something. So they could be big R or big R little r. And what you would do is, with each individual that's normal, you would have to look at their children and look at their parents and try to determine if it's big R or big R little r. There are some cases, especially in a recessive pedigree, where you will not be able to be sure, and it could happen in a dominant pedigree as well, where you're not sure what the genotype is. You know it's big R something, but you can't maybe necessarily be sure because there's not any really giveaway information that's provided in the family. And that happens sometimes too. So you just leave it big R, and then I usually just put a blank, big R line, and you leave it ambiguous like that. So I hope this helps with the first step of being able to start to look at pedigrees. I also have another video on how to determine X linkage in a pedigree.